Hello, everybody. If you're watching this, there's a chance you're going, hey, wait a minute, this is Dead Domain. I didn't know they make video game content. I didn't sign up for this, or some other permutation thereof. But yes, if you haven't been following me a long time, you might not know I've actually done a ton of video game content, including documentaries, video essays, reviews, and more. I am a media critic after all, and this is how the channel got started. Which is why, as I cross 100,000 subscribers, I want to thank everybody who's followed me so far on this journey. And I wanted to take a second and kind of look back at the series I really started this channel with, my ranking shooter series, and put in another entry for everybody who's followed me for so long and the people I know who still enjoy this series. With that in mind, I hope you enjoy this latest episode ranking every Xbox 360 era shooter I can find. Originally, my first Call of Duty in this shooter ranking series was going to be Modern Warfare 3 to coincide with last year's announcement of the worst Modern Warfare 3, but I lost the footage, so to coincide with this year's announcement of a new Black Ops, let's revisit Treyarch's first step in the Black Ops series, 2010's Call of Duty Black Ops. Back when Call of Duty outside of World War II still had a bit of novelty, Black Ops came out swinging with an identifiably different style from the Michael Bay, Tom Clancy inspirations of Soap and Price's adventures. Coming off the grim and gritty World at War, Treyarch continued their Attitude Era with a Vietnam-adjacent Cold War spy thriller about brainwashing, shifting alliances, and maybe killing JFK. The style is easily the first thing you notice about Black Ops, and undeniably what still sets it apart from not just other campaigns in the yearly franchise, but from its own contemporaries. From the greasy, sweaty textures covering everything to the graphic violence that had been absent in Infinity Ward's games, to the redacted dossier aesthetic that even blacked out elements of the mission opening screens, and of course, the fractured sideshow of the mid-mission briefings representing the interrogation of the main character Alex Mason. Even a decade later, there's something tactile to the world Black Ops creates and stews the player in that feels like getting your hands dirty as the protagonist of an explosive pulp novel spy story. Much of the game takes place technically from a single chair. You play as Alex Mason, a soldier captured and being interrogated in a race against time to stop a pending terrorist attack. As the story unfolds, you discover how and why Mason would be able to stop a Russian attack as a United States soldier, and the connections between Mason, a sequence of numbers he continually hears, and his Russian companion, all culminating in a twist that blew every 12-year-old's mind in 2010. I have played this game along with Modern Warfare 1 and 2 and Black Ops 2 backwards and forwards so many times, I basically still have most of the dialogue memorized. So 10 years on, is it still fun to go back to, even after knowing the twist ending and how much shooters have advanced since? Thankfully, I'm always glad to go back to these games and find that, yeah, they're still pretty damn good shooters, and Black Ops is up there with the first two Modern Warfare games as some of the best the series has to offer, even if it doesn't quite reach the same heights. The thing that mostly holds the first Black Ops back is it is stultifying in its linearity. Yeah, most of these shooters from this era are glorified hallways, but Black Ops feels more linear and handholdy than most. You are funneled from one guided sequence to the next, and the game feels almost afraid of letting you experiment too much with just the basic gunplay and weapons before shoving you into another guided set piece where you're guiding allies, in Overwatch or one of the game's many explosive turret sequences. Part of this might just be the creep of Call of Duty's yearly release schedule coming into focus, where devs began tailoring what they could do in a game in their tight dev cycle without overextending, and honestly, while it's a bummer the game feels so regimented, it's probably for the best because despite its bullishness to let the player off the hook, it's still a slick and involving action romp that sings fairly often. The biggest missed opportunity here is the fluid and crunchy COD gameplay still hits, but you rarely get to really savor the more unique weapons. There are plenty of standouts like an explosive bolt crossbow, the Dragon Breath incendiary shotgun, and a brief date with a minigun, but some of these sections last literal seconds. This isn't like Halo where you can pack a good weapon over half a sprawling level. The game will tell you when and where you can indulge in these power fantasies. I thought we were fighting for freedom, goddammit. What is this commie bullshit telling me when and where I can use a minigun? And these brief sections are in service of the lifeblood of Call of Duty campaigns at this point, gameplay variety. Modern Warfare and Modern Warfare 2 got positive reception for the AC-130 section and vehicle sections like snowmobiles and boats, so Black Ops rides those coattails. You've got motorcycles, Apocalypse Now-inspired riverboat rides, helicopter dogfights, and then the aforementioned turret sequences. This constant switching between styles could easily become boring even in turret sequences, but Black Ops knows the key to making brief gameplay sections empowering and engaging. Make sure shit is blowing up all the time. Like, even when nothing is around to blow up, they give you guns to shoot things that blow up. This gameplay flow holds up for the majority of the campaign as you unravel Mason's backstory, and the level variety, at least visually, matches pace. Black Ops makes wonderful use of color theory, casting levels in vibrant red and orange hues, nearly monochrome white and black, vibrant jungle greens, or sickly yellow tones to match the tone of the story and environments at that moment. This visual variety isn't realistic, it's art design, something you might not think of when you hear the name Call of Duty, but it helps to maintain the slick, cinematic presentation and feels so much more tangible than something like the more recent Modern Warfare games with their strictly photorealistic grading that by comparison looks unbelievably boring. If it seems like I keep going back to the last two Modern Warfare games, it's because going back to a game from 14 years ago brings into such stark realization how hollow and sauceless those games are. They are prettier, more open in their gameplay, have better sound design, and have more polished animations, but they don't use them for anything exciting or interesting, which is where they fail where Black Ops succeeds. Like I said earlier, this game has very little variety in terms of level layout. There aren't any branching paths, you're always notified where to go, who to follow, and what to do. There are really no rough edges here, and that's likely by design. This is a product made to go down smooth no matter who's playing it. It funnels you from objective to objective, from one engaging set piece to fluid shooting gameplay, covering everything in memorable, often colorful environments and characters along the way. It's also a good reminder of why characters like Woods became iconic. With his platoon-inspired cranky growl and constant attitude, the dude is a perfectly vicious companion for this dark, violent world. Like, he straight up wouldn't fit in the Modern Warfare games. Frank Woods seems like he was born being lubricated from the constant sweat dripping from his pores. I think he literally bleeds red, white, and blue, and he never uses stain remover when he bleeds because those are also the only colors he wears. He's so rugged, he makes the original Ghost look downright estrogenated. Frank Woods sees how Ghost went out and knows that he would have taken Shepard out first because he's built different. But testosterone reservoirs aside, after a decade, the story itself is just okay. By the standards of the era, Woods, Mason, and Bowman's journey is still cinematic and engrossing, but the characterizations are thin, and most of the emotional beats are taken straight from other media, like the Viet Cong Russian roulette scene ripped from The Deer Hunter. But the game is elevated by its wonderful cast, including Ed Harris, Sam Worthington, Ice Cube, and primarily Gary Oldman's role as Viktor Reznov, Mason's friend from his time in a Russian work camp and right hand through most of the campaign. The twist surrounding Reznov is probably ridiculously easy to see coming nowadays, but the way Treyarch layered their Shyamalanian twist over the standard gameplay tropes of the era feels intentional and actually pretty inspired. For example, how often in these military shooters does the average player actually pay attention to who is speaking and responding outside of objectives? Paying special attention to this when Reznov is around gave me a new appreciation for Black Ops' story. It's not revolutionary, it's not wildly unpredictable, but it tells a more personal story, and against its gritty backdrop and uniquely grim aesthetic, that helps it stick out against the rest of the series, and especially what competitors were coming up with. Hey, remember when EA rebooted Medal of Honor to go up against this game? Kind of funny how the modern Warfare games are bad for most of the same reasons that those EA Medal of Honor games were. After a while, Call of Duty games can understandably blur together, even for shooter fans. In many ways, Black Ops isn't too different from the rest. It's tightly paced action that isn't particularly challenging in content or gameplay, with gameplay that comes and goes like fast food. But even with fast food, there's a hierarchy. Everybody knows the bad Taco Bell or the bad McDonald's nearby their house. You know, the one that doesn't make things fresh, where the taste just isn't good. If the most recent Call of Duty entries are the bad Taco Bell, Black Ops feels more like the good local taqueria. It's still cheap, still goes down easy, but the ingredients taste fresh and different. There's a real texture here, and I can absolutely recommend it to anyone looking for a hot meal. Are you missing out on anything aside from a few memes and references if you don't play Black Ops? No. But it's also still an engaging, gritty, and unique shooter, even if it doesn't last long and can't quite stack up to what Infinity Ward was putting out at the time. Since the release of Resident Evil 7 in 2017, the Resident Evil series has been releasing banger after banger, and also RE-verse. Remember RE-verse? Of course you don't. In some ways, RE-verse was a throwback to a worse time for the series, one filled with ill-conceived ideas that weren't executed well and felt at odds with the entire tone and style of the series up to that point. Go check out this essay I did on the whole series for more information on that. Yet among this era of bounty for the Resident Evil series we find ourselves in, as we look ahead to what comes next after the spectacular Resident Evil 4 remake, I can't help but wonder if it's a remake of Resident Evil 5. The entry that started the franchise down the dark road that culminated in games like Operation Raccoon City, Resident Evil 6, and just generally the overall worst period for the beloved horror franchise. Resident Evil 5 is an odd game for me, one that holds a lot of nostalgia. It was actually my first Resident Evil game, followed closely by Resident Evil Deadly Silence on the Nintendo DS. As a fan of Silent Hill, it wasn't what I expected, and I was a bit lost in the dense lore, yet the action worked well enough for middle school Jordan to find enjoyable. Over time, I've grown less fond of it, maybe because I've played through it easily 10 times by now, but also for some of the rougher aspects that haven't aged very well. When people started speculating that an RE5 remake was in the works, some dorks came out and said, "You can't remake this because it would be called racist because you shoot black people." Couple of notes, because this is an argument that's actually kind of interesting. You absolutely can remake Resident Evil 5, but some things would have to be adjusted. The game isn't racist because black people get shot, because for much of the game, the groups of enemies you fight include plenty of variety among skin tones. However, some of the depictions of African tribal life are outdated and racist and play into stereotypes and caricatures. Like, you cannot think Sheva's tribal costume is okay. This is like the Justin Trudeau of video games here. How did anyone think this was fine, even at the time? But that doesn't mean everything in the game about the indigenous tribes would necessarily need to be entirely removed. The swampland section of the game is actually incredibly important to the overall narrative, because it's where you find that the reason the tribe has been overtaken by the parasite is through some good old corporation bad capitalist exploitation. It isn't about portraying these people as monstrous caricatures of outdated savage archetypes, but showing them as secluded indigenous tribes that lived peacefully and happily until a corporation began experimenting on them. This could easily be remade and slightly adjusted to have less 1930s racism, and boom, Resident Evil 5 remake. Capcom, I'm available for consulting. I'll take my payment in the form of a new Darkstalkers and Devil May Cry 6. Now, if you're unfamiliar with Resident Evil 5, you might be thinking, swamplands? African tribes? I thought Resident Evil was a horror game about zombies and mansions. Congratulations on living in 2001, but also, yes, as I've already mentioned, RE5 is where the series started to go off the deep end into straight-up action shooter territory, following the footsteps of Resident Evil 4 and cranking everything up to 200% and adding co-op. For those who don't know, Resident Evil 4 and 5 don't control like most other third-person shooters, because you stand still while aiming. This might sound like a recipe for frustrating disaster, but like Resident Evil 4, RE5 takes this slower pace into account with its enemy AI and animation speeds, creating a pretty thrilling gameplay pace that often feels like you're just barely avoiding damage. Though because of the constant player partner, either manned by an incredibly stupid AI or by another player, RE5 does have a faster gameplay pace than RE4. It's a game that can be described as tense, but despite some great horror monster designs, it's rarely scary. Don't get me wrong, there are some great intense horror sequences, like the opening village siege that amps the Resident Evil 4 Ganado fight to 11, or being trapped in a lab with an army of lickers. But the moments that will get your heart palpitations going are few and far between. You're never really fighting alone, or even in the dark, both staples of tension in horror games. So how does a game where you're not alone, fighting during the day, fit into a classic horror franchise? Weirdly, if you couldn't tell already, this is such a goddamn weird game, but also taken on its own merits as a shooter, it's still a mostly excellent gameplay experience because of just how polished it is, in spite of its weirdness. Resident Evil 5 might be one of the most important games in the series narratively, too, which makes it all the weirder. It caps off narrative threads that began in the original game, ties into previous entries more directly than Resident Evil 4 did, and also reveals important backstory about Umbrella and the origins of the T-Virus. But look, Resident Evil has never been a series about depth or subtlety, so do not expect any here. Chris and Sheva are likable, and their growth into a partner dynamic is believable, but every other character here is some shade of cartoon. This is a roller coaster ride where you fight giant mutant crab monsters and giant bat caterpillars, and giants, just lots of giant stuff. Resident Evil 5 famously had a marketing campaign that didn't really align with the finished project, playing on Chris maybe having PTSD and being even more horror-focused than Resident Evil 4. I don't know if it was just bad marketing or a development pivot, but another reason I'd love to see an RE5 remake would be to align with this vision of a sun-bleached mutant horror phantasmagoria like an international Texas Chainsaw Massacre with batterpillars. Despite an often incredulous and ridiculous story, the environments and level design really steal the show here. Chris and Sheva's journey takes them through a variety of standard locales like warehouses and laboratories, but the grungy sun-bleached aesthetic helps set them apart from your average shooter around this time. Then there are plenty of other unique settings like a semi-open lake area with isolated village areas, a weird series of levels where you just become a Tomb Raider, and then of course the iconic over-the-top final boss in a damn volcano. Other small innovations have been made on Resident Evil 4, most noticeably the inventory system and upgrades. There's no merchant or expandable inventory you upgrade between missions or deaths, and share inventory with your partner. However, the inventory is also slotted smartly to the D-pad, allowing you to quickly reorganize weapons, reload, and swap with your partner, even during firefights. It's an understandable concession for the co-op game because can you imagine having to wait for your partner to slot around an entire Resident Evil 4-sized briefcase? Like in Resident Evil 4, you can find a variety of treasures dropped by strong enemies and throughout the environments that can be sold to upgrade gear. The gear upgrade system is meant to be used for multiple playthroughs and difficulties, and the plentiful treasures to find can be addicting to search for and remember the locations of on subsequent playthroughs. So as a Resident Evil game and a horror game, Resident Evil 5 isn't the most sterling example of the series' glory days. But as an action game, it's still pretty damn good. There's a lot of solid variety, including explosive turret sequences, memorable bosses, and killer enemy variety. The Ouroboros plague that infects the village of Kajuju presents a constantly evolving enemy roster that places you on the back foot most of the time. Just when you think you've got an enemy group handled, one of them grows a mutant tentacle out of its head or turns into a fleshy tank that can kill you in one shot. Part of surviving the various enemies is in learning their habits and how you can maximize damage, including the return of Resident Evil 4's kneecapping, where you shoot enemies in the knees to stagger them so you can unleash a devastating melee blow. Little techniques like this are key to surviving as it conserves the fairly stingy ammo and works for crowd control. The weapon selection here is fairly standard, with a series of basic shotguns, machine guns, pistols, and rifles you'll rotate between as you upgrade gear and find new, more powerful weapon variants. There are a few standouts like stun rods and a minigun meant to be an unlockable endgame bonus, but aside from that, this is a solid weapon roster with few standouts that thrives on great feedback and balance with enemy AI and animation speed. In fact, that gameplay balance is kind of why Resident Evil 5 succeeds in spite of itself. This is a bizarre, ridiculous game, but it still just kind of works. Somehow, when all of its elements come together. Its gameplay is consistently evolving and innovating on itself in ways that force the player to improvise, and all of the quality gameplay is made even better when playing with a partner who can coordinate weapons and strategies. If you've never played the series, this is not the best place to start. And in an era of more stripped-down, back-to-basics remakes and first-person games that actually scare, I can't recommend it over any Resident Evil game that's hit since 2017. But as a weird black sheep of the series, it's far superior to what came immediately after, and is still an incredibly polished, entertaining, and downright ridiculous game that's worth playing. After several years of rumors and very little else, the Perfect Dark reboot has finally been revealed at Xbox's most recent Totally Not an E3 conference, and as expected, people are mad at Joanna Dark's new look, which I could tell the second she came on stream. This isn't the surprising part, as if you followed my channel for a while, you know that the current crop of prominent gaming YouTubers form a reactionary brigade that impulsively melt down whenever a woman isn't an anime caricature. So when the new design for Joanna Dark was revealed, they immediately began comparing her not to the original design she actually shares the resemblance with, but her more sexy Perfect Dark Zero counterpart. On the surface, Jo in Perfect Dark Zero is more slim, an Avril Lavigne-coded bundle of mid-2000s fashion tropes. She looks like the Esurance mascot's Evanescence phase. While she is canonically in her 20s, she does look like a teenager, so I understand why some of these guys might immediately thirst over her. Interestingly, doing some digging, I found that back in 2005, Rare did a sexualized cover shoot for her character model, which is bonkers and may lead to a video looking at the many times this has happened. But I also found that despite being explicitly sexualized, she was still not perfect enough for internet forum nerds. Anyway, the point is that the new Joanna design had a bunch of people saying, look how sexy and good the franchise used to be. Much like Resident Evil 5, so many of the people making these claims and assumptions just seemingly have never actually played this damn game, because Perfect Dark Zero isn't very good. It's impossible to play this game without comparing it to its predecessor. The first thing you'll likely notice if you're a fan of Rare's N64 follow-up to GoldenEye is a massive difference in style. While this is meant to be a prequel to Joanna Dark's adventure, it is saturated in what I can graciously refer to as a mid-2000s look. The look is a mixed bag because while I appreciate the often colorful environments, everything else is so garishly of its era. I don't think I've ever seen a game feel so much like the time it was made in. This game is what the year 2005 tastes like. From the Jet Set Radio Reject designs that make up the characters, to the soundtrack that mixes butt rock guitar riffs and inexplicable pop beats, this game lacks the timelessness of the first game's fairly timeless, pseudo-cyberpunk corporate thriller look. Every one of these characters looks like they had a MySpace page that played a different Avril Lavigne song. But honestly, the look is the least of this game's problems. In fact, I'd say overall graphically, it's aged very well. By leaning ever so slightly into Rare's typically more animated aesthetic, the assets are full of crisp textures and lighting, and along with the more colorful environments, gives the game a nice smooth look, at least when it's not throwing a frankly ridiculous amount of god rays all over the place. The graphics are not as kind to the plastic-looking digital puppets they try to pass off as character models. In fact, I'm also going to say it works in tandem with the story being absolute ass, and another point I'll get to in a minute, being that the game feels incredibly rushed. But first, the gameplay. You play as a super spy mercenary working for the Datadyne Corporation, uncovering a conspiracy, I guess? The story is nigh impenetrable to follow with any accuracy, as characters continually pop in and out with very little feeling or warning. There are good guys, there are bad guys, you're the good guy, and you're gonna eventually kill the bad guy. The meat of the game here is the gameplay, and in motion the game looks dated. It's a very odd case where you can tell they tried to preserve the feel of the original game from 5 years previous, but also innovate on it. The result is this mishmash middle ground that never feels better than just okay. The movement is floaty, and while the gun handling is mostly fine, it's underserved by the incredibly stupid AI that maintains the same style of ragdoll from the N64, so that hit detection can feel completely off as you pump rounds in enemies that are technically already dead. They just have animations that take forever to play out. I say the weapon handling is technically okay because the one thing Perfect Dark Zero tried to do interestingly was weapon zoom, handled on the left trigger. That's fine, but the degree of zoom is determined by how much you press when you pull on the trigger, which sounds interesting until you realized how used to holding a trigger all the way down you are, and you're in a sniper fight where you actually only need to be holding it half as hard. Like I said, it's interesting, but it is very uncomfortable. Aside from wonky zooming, the weapons are just fine. You've got some neat returning faves like the laptop gun, which is a novelty that can be transformed into a turret, but by and large you'll be using mid-range auto rifles and the starting sniper pistol unless the game very specifically hints you should be using rocket launchers or snipers in specific areas. You've got some other things like akimbo guns, a shield, and the Psychosis gun, which sounds way cooler than it is. The Psychosis gun is a late-game pistol that makes you go crazy in a world where Psychosis is just annoying beer goggles. It does nothing of note to enemies, doesn't even seem to make them turn on one another or cower in fear, which is a missed opportunity like most of this game. The other aspects of gameplay that technically work fine are the dodge, roll, and cover system, which basically plays like Gears of War despite coming out a year earlier. However, it lacks Gears' magnetic slide to cover tuning, so you have to basically be standing completely still at a piece of eligible cover. Pieces of cover can even be physics objects like boxes that can be blown away or moved by enemy fire, which is actually very neat. The original Perfect Dark, following in the footsteps of GoldenEye, had a unique approach to difficulty and objectives, giving players more advanced objectives in addition to harder enemy variety. Zero follows the same idea, but it doesn't play out nearly as well. The objective variety is painfully lacking and often gives you very little knowledge of what your objectives look like, leading to some backtracking and frustrating trial and error. So the objectives are often simplified to turn this thing off, reach this area, but you don't get much help aside from an automatic objective marker that handholds you if you take too long. Some missions are worse because of this than others, like an incredibly bad stealth mission where if you raise the alarm 3 times on normal, you fail. However, there didn't seem to be any way to actually sneak past some enemies, at least not that the game spells out. I was getting frustrated with this because the game has absolutely wretched checkpoints. Levels may have one checkpoint if it's particularly long, but if not, you will be restarting from the beginning. So in the case of this frustrating stealth level, that involved tripping an alarm I had no idea how to avoid, methodically killing the hordes that came after me, and moving on only to fail later and have to spend 10 plus minutes rinsing and repeating. And worse, you restart at a checkpoint with the default weapon loadout. So if you had a strong weapon that was helping you move ahead, you're back to the pistol or whatever you brought into the level. These frustrations aren't helped by the incredibly stupid AI who have one move, and that is running in a straight line and attacking en masse like a white Midwestern woman on Black Friday lunging for the last George Foreman doorbuster. They're never hard to deal with, but they get annoying, even on the easiest difficulty, because of how much is just constantly thrown at you. Zero completely misses the sandbox feel of the original and its objectives, yet at the same time, its vacuous, empty environments lead to just spending minutes doing nothing. Like seriously, some of the larger environments towards the end of the game just see you walking across barren fields like you forgot your horse in Red Dead Redemption. The environments are varied across a few biomes, including underwater bases, Chinese back alleys, and more, but they're reused to such a ridiculous degree you often move backwards and forwards through the same area, sometimes more than twice. This is one thing that makes the game feel padded and rushed during development, along with, as I mentioned at the beginning, a terrible story where things just kind of happen with very little explanation. Like two cowboy brother mercenaries with laptop guns that appear talking about collecting a bounty. Then you kill them and they're never brought up again. Were they meant to be recurring characters? Were they a reference to something from the original? I don't know or care really. It feels like there are entire sections of the game just sort of missing. Like one mission in the jungle ends with Joanna disobeying orders and appearing to go rogue, and the next minute she's rescuing allies I never saw being taken hostage and back in contact with her commander. Between these strange lapses in the story that aren't helped by the stilted cutscenes, the backtracking, and large empty environments, so much of this thing feels rushed at nearly every level. And then it culminates in a final boss that's truly unbelievably bad as you snipe with only a pistol. And the story just kind of ends, I guess, as you kill the yellow panic villain that looks like a piece of anti-Japanese World War II propaganda came to life. Moment to moment, Perfect Dark Zero feels fine to play, and even manages to rise to good on occasion, but it has none of the charm or soul of the original game's world and design, and certainly none of the polish, despite outflanking Joanna's N64 adventure by 5 years and 2 console generations. If there's a reason why nobody talks about Zero, it's because it's kind of embarrassing to the good name of Perfect Dark. It feels like a rushed, empty, and often frustrating game that just happens to bear the name of Perfect Dark, rather than proudly wear the franchise title. Even if I don't necessarily like the move to an entirely realistic style for the new reboot, I'm excited to see Joanna back in action, if only to get the stale taste of this wasted potential out of my mouth. Perfect Dark Zero kinda sucks. Well, there you have it. Thank you for watching this latest episode of my shooter ranking series, even though I know this thing will not get even half of the views as one of my regular videos that I don't, quite put as much work into. I still like to do these videos every now and again to remind myself, get back to my roots and all that fun stuff. So if you enjoyed this, if it's your first time seeing one of these videos, go check out the playlist and watch all the other 51 now games I've ranked as part of this series. Let me know if you've played any of these games, or if you would like to even support me making videos like this and plenty of others. This is obviously not the content I'm known for. Check out the links down below to throw a couple bucks my way and help make sure I can keep making the weird stuff that makes me passionate and makes me happy. So thank you very much for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, do all the fun things, and I will see you all next time.